How long do you typically spend on your colored pencil artwork, and would you like it to go a little bit faster? Hey, I'm Lana Glowshot, and in this video, I'm going to show you how I created this piece in a fraction of the time that it usually takes me to do a similar piece of this size. The first tip that I have for you is to work on a piece of stained or toned paper. When you work on a piece of toned paper, you don't have to spend as much time building up your colors and values or judging your values. On a white piece of paper, you're building everything up from zero. But when you work on a toned surface, you can build up the darks and also build up the lights. For this particular piece, I used a piece of Luxe Archival sanded paper, and that sheet of paper does come bright white, but before I even begin, I stain the entire surface. And for this particular piece, I stained the surface a bright red-orange color so that it could really play off the complementary greens in the composition, and pieces of that could show through. If I was working on a white piece of paper, I wouldn't really be able to allow white to come through the same way because it would look super unfinished. But here, it really just reads as a painterly effect, which is awesome. If you are not interested in working on sanded paper and staining it yourself, there are tons of other great options. Pastel Matte comes in so many different colors, so you could pick out the perfect color for your composition. And I love Pastel Matte for rendering animals and fur. If you are working with charcoal or graphite, you might consider working on a toned surface like Canson Mi Tienes or something like this craft paper. Additionally, if you're working with just colored pencils and you don't want to start off with a really bold brand new color, you might consider working with Stonehenge colors, which are a little bit lighter in value. So you're not working in that mid-range value necessarily, but they can be a great option for you if you're just kind of nudging into working on a toned surface. Tip number 2 is to batch your projects. Occasionally, a lot of time is spent transitioning in between different phases of the project or transitioning from one project to another. For this reason, I like to batch my projects so that I can work on similar parts of the process all at once on 2 to 5 different pieces. For this particular series, I started by selecting 3 photographs that all had similar characteristics, color schemes, and subject matter that I could handle in very similar ways. And then I took 3 pieces of the sanded paper and I stained them all the exact same color, all at the same time. Cleaned that mess up, transitioned over to panpastels. I then applied the panpastel base to all 3 before I moved on to the colored pencil. And in that transition period, I sprayed all of them with a textured fixative, which is another time-consuming piece in and of itself, but this way I could spray all 3 of them at the same time. Tip number 3 is to apply a base layer with a quick medium. For me, the base layer is really just there to figure out my color relationships and my values so that I can then come over the top with those final details. I'm able to lay in a panpastel base layer for a piece this size, which is about 6 by 6 inches, in 30 minutes or less, which is a game changer. For a similar sized piece, I am usually spending 2 to 3 hours, maybe even more, on a base layer when I'm just working in colored pencils. And yes, those base layers are a little bit tighter and more detailed, but they aren't always necessary that early on in the process. If you don't have panpastels or want to experiment with other mediums, there are so many other mediums that can lay in a really quick base layer. Watercolor pencils, Inktense pencils and blocks. You could use markers, you could use so many other materials. But you just want to make sure that they are compatible with each other and that they're compatible with your surface. So if you have questions about a mixed media approach that's going to speed up your color pencil process, or if you have a request that you would like me to demo in an upcoming video, be sure to drop it down in the comments below. The 4th tip that I have for you is to be intentional with the colors you have available. I have noticed that there is a huge disparity in how long a piece takes just based on the colors that an artist has available to them while they're working. This sounds super crazy, but hear me out. When I'm working with my pan pastels, I love working with my 80 set and laying them all out because I don't have to spend very much time mixing up specific colors. I can just grab a color that's super close, maybe nudge it a little bit in one direction or the other, and then apply it onto my paper. And this really speeds up the base layer for me. So one tip that I have for you is to potentially invest in a larger set of pencils or pan pastels if you're interested in speeding up your process. But this tip actually works the other way as well. Some artists can be really overwhelmed by having a ton of pencils or a ton of pan pastels available to them. So if you fall into this camp, you might consider narrowing down your palette and working with a more limited palette. And the most limited palette that you could work with is just a black and a white. But you could build this up and work with just the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, and do a study learning how to use just those three colors. And then you could build it up more and more from there. So depending on where you're at, you might consider either expanding your color palette or drastically limiting your color palette, and this could speed you up. I love making these YouTube videos. It is so rewarding to hear that they are helping you and giving you new ideas and answering your questions. But the process of making a YouTube video is incredibly time consuming. So if you have benefited from some part of this video, I invite you to show your love and appreciation by nudging that like button. Thank you so much for your continued support. I really appreciate it. The fifth tip that I have for you is to invest in and use quality art supplies. Now, I 100% understand that quality art supplies are expensive, and there's definitely a draw to purchase a lower quality supply. But using lower quality colored pencils in a project actually has a big risk associated with it. For this particular piece, I'm using Luminance colored pencils, and yes, they are a little bit over $4 a pencil, which can add up incredibly fast. But they are made to blend, they are made to layer, and they're made to last, which can't be said for a really cheap craft set of colored pencils like Crayola. If you are going to invest 6, 10, 20, or 100 hours into a piece of fine art, please also invest a little bit of money into quality art supplies. This is going to make you happier during the process. It's going to result in a higher quality product, and you'll probably be able to complete your artwork faster because you won't be fighting the materials. If you are interested in learning more about the quality art materials that I like using, I'm going to link a video to all of the supplies that I use in this piece and the other pieces in this series in the notes below, along with links to my favorite art supplies. Tip number 6 is to select a focal point. Sometimes we spend a lot of time on our drawing in areas that don't matter nearly as much as the main attraction or the focal point. I want you to look at your photo reference or your still life reference and determine what is the most important part of this drawing and what do I want people to spend the most time looking at. For this particular piece, I determined that the focal point would be the figs, and from there I developed a hierarchy. The figs were the most important part, and then they would require the most detail and the most attention. From there, the leaves closest to the figs were the second most important, so they would have the second most amount of detail. And then from there, the leaves that receded into the background would have the least amount of detail and the least amount of attention. So for this piece, I spent about 3 hours rendering the very specific texture on these figs and making sure that each and every part of them were exactly the way that I wanted. And then with the rest of the 2.5 hours that I had to spend on this piece, I use that strategically throughout the rest. I added detail to the leaves, but I didn't add every single detail because they weren't the most important part. I added some detail, specifically the shape and the contours to the leaves that were further back, but I let a lot of those fine details go, and I spent a lot less time on those areas that were receding into the background. My 7th tip for you is to actually adjust your style and loosen up. Give yourself permission to not draw every single wrinkle or every single tiny vein in the leaf. Be a little bit more painterly, be a little bit more expressive, and work on techniques, styles, approaches that are faster. Now, this doesn't have to be a lifelong adoption. You don't have to be a loose, painterly, expressive artist all the time. This could be something that just happens in your sketchbook or just happens on the occasional piece. But it does give you some permission to speed up your process, to experiment with new techniques. And if you're always completely focused on getting every single tiny little detail, you're not going to learn as much because you are going to be taking so long for every piece. You're just not going to have as much time to explore and try new things. In this video, you learned how to speed up your colored pencil artwork. And you might not choose to use each and every one of these tips every single time, but it's all about expanding your toolkit and giving you more options. If you want to expand your toolkit a little further and you're interested in a classical approach to color pencil painting, I invite you to check out the free preview to my course, Introduction to Classical Colored Pencil Painting, where I have taken the practices of classical oil painting masters and adapted them to be used by colored pencil artists. The link to that free preview is in the notes below. I will be back next week with a really fun what not to do video. So if you are interested in learning what not to do with your pan pastels, be sure to turn on your notifications or sign up for my email list so that you don't miss when next week's video goes live. Well, that's all for now. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of this video. Go have a beautiful, creative, and awesome day. Bye.